At Christmas dinner, my wife pushed my mother to the very end of the table and set a single dry piece of bread in front of her. No butter, no sides, no place setting that matched the rest of ours. Just a lonely white plate and a crust of bread. And as my mother, Marjorie Weaver, 78 years old, only 2 weeks out of hip surgery, tried to break that bread with her shaking hands, something inside me snapped. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flip the table. I simply reached for my phone and sent a message that would change the course of that night forever. But before I tell you what happened after that message, you need to understand how we got to that moment. My name is Frank Weaver, and I've lived in Holland, Michigan my whole life. I've worked maintenance at Holland Community Hospital for nearly 3 decades. I'm not a dramatic man by nature. I get up, I fix what's broken, I clock out, I go home. I married Linda 12 years ago. She's always cared more about appearances than I ever did, but I thought we balanced each other out. And my mother, quiet, dignified, always smelling faintly of lavender lotion, moved in with us temporarily while she healed from her surgery. Linda didn't like it. She didn't say it at first, but I could feel it in her clipped tones, the way she sighed when Mom shuffled into the living room, the way she wiped the counters twice whenever Mom leaned on them for support. She kept saying, "It's just until the new year," like it was a prison sentence. Still, I didn't expect Christmas to go the way it did. Linda had decorated the house beautifully, string lights, gold ribbon, cinnamon candles burning on every surface. The dining table was set with her mother's old china. My in-laws, Carl and Denise, arrived dressed like they were going to an executive dinner, not a family holiday. Everything looked perfect, except for the way they treated my mother. Dinner was served buffet style from the kitchen island. I carried in the honey-glazed ham from Mayor's steam rising off the pan. Linda spooned mashed potatoes with melted butter into everyone's bowl. Cranberry sauce, roasted green beans, hot rolls, everything smelled warm and festive. But when I looked over at the far end of the table, Mom sat on a folding chair we normally kept in the garage. No placemat, no napkin, no real portion of food. Just that one pitiful crust of bread. "Linda," I said quietly, "why doesn't Mom have—" She cut me off loudly enough for her parents to hear. "My parents can't stand that hospital disinfectant smell on her," she said, waving her hand as though explaining a minor inconvenience. I just sat her down there for the moment. The way Carl and Denise nodded so casually, so approvingly, sent heat crawling up my spine. They didn't even look at my mother. They kept eating, praising the ham, talking about their winter trip to Arizona. My mother must have sensed my anger because she gave me a small, shaky smile. "I'm fine, honey," she whispered. "Really?" But I watched her try to break that bread in half. Her fingers trembled. She winced, probably from her hip or from the dryness scraping her throat, and still she lifted the tiny piece like she was grateful for it. She took a slow, painful bite. She chewed carefully, like swallowing hurt. Her eyes flicked up to me again, and she tried to smile. That was it. That was the moment something in me tore clean down the middle. I clenched my fists under the table. I felt my heart pounding so hard I thought someone else would hear it. My vision tunneled, nothing but my mother and that plate. That stupid, empty plate. Linda kept laughing with her parents, pretending none of this mattered. I didn't trust myself to speak. So I pushed back my chair and walked into the hallway. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the battle inside me. I'd spent years avoiding conflict, smoothing things over, trying to keep everyone happy. But tonight I couldn't do it. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a name I hadn't contacted in a while. Jim Talbot, retired Marine Gunnery Sergeant Commander at VFW Post 8672, and one of the men who'd watched my mother tend to wounded soldiers and factory workers for decades. I typed, "Jim, I need your help tonight." My finger hovered over send. For a moment I hesitated, not because I doubted what I was doing, but because I knew once I pressed that button, there would be no turning back. Linda would explode. Her parents would be horrified. My marriage, I didn't know what would happen to it. But then I pictured the way my mother's hands trembled, the way she forced that smile, the way she tried to swallow that dry bread. I hit send. Not 5 seconds later, my phone buzzed. Jim replied, "What's going on, Frank? Want me to come by?" I swallowed hard and typed back a short explanation. His next message came quicker than I expected. "We're coming, 10 minutes. I whispered out loud. I turned back toward the dining room. From the hallway, I could see my mother still trying to make conversation with Denise, who wasn't even looking at her. I saw Linda laughing at something Carl said. I saw that empty plate. And I knew I hadn't just asked for help. I'd lit a fuse. 10 minutes, I thought. 10 minutes until everything changed. Jim's message. "We're coming." 10 minutes kept flashing in my mind as I slipped my phone back into my pocket. I stood in the hallway staring at the closed pantry door, trying to slow my breathing. I'm not a man who takes risks, not a man who shakes things up. But standing there listening to the muffled sounds of laughter from the dining room, while my mother sat alone at the far end of the table with a crust of bread, I knew I'd finally crossed a line I should have drawn years ago. I took a moment to gather myself before walking back into the dining room. Linda barely glanced at me. She was too busy telling her parents a story about a co-worker's vacation to Cabo. My mother sat quietly, hands folded, trying not to look like someone who'd been pushed aside. She caught my eye and gave me one of her soft smiles, the kind she used to give when I was a boy, and scraped my knee pretending everything was fine, even when it wasn't. My chest tightened. I looked away before she could see the anger on my face. Linda's voice cut through the air. "Frank, can you bring out the sparkling cider? Mom and Dad prefer it to wine." "Not your mom and dad, just hers." I nodded mostly because I didn't trust my voice. In the kitchen, I leaned against the counter and took a long breath, trying to steady myself. The warm smell of glazed ham mixed with cinnamon candles, comforting scents for most people. But for me, they were suffocating. As I opened the fridge, my mind drifted to the past, back to when my mother worked as the head nurse at Holland Community Hospital. She'd worn those blue scrubs like armor. Even after 12-hour shifts, she'd come home humming, smelling faintly of lavender lotion and hand sanitizer. She had a way of calming people, of treating every patient like family. I grew up watching her leave for night shifts in the dead of winter snow, up to her knees, never complaining. She raised me alone after Dad died when I was 15. She worked double shifts to keep us afloat. She paid for my community college classes with money she should have spent on herself. And yet the same woman who had held dying men's hands, who had comforted strangers when their families couldn't, was now sitting at the end of my dining table with a dry piece of bread because she smelled like disinfectant. I felt shame burn through me, not for her, but for letting this happen under my roof. My phone buzzed again. A second message from Jim. "Frank, we're bringing the Marjorie Weaver crew." I froze. I hadn't heard that name in years. Back when Mom was still working, a few younger nurses had jokingly called themselves the Weaver crew because Mom trained them so well. Over time, the nickname spread among hospital staff, EMTs, even local veterans Mom had treated after accidents or surgeries. She'd become something of a legend, calm, steady, unshakable Marjorie. I typed back, "Who exactly is coming?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, reappeared, then, "You'll see, and Frank, this is long overdue." My pulse kicked up. I peeked back into the dining room just in time to see Carl wrinkle his nose discreetly as my mother shifted in her chair. Denise whispered something to Linda, who chuckled under her breath. Mom kept her gaze fixed on her hands, pretending she didn't notice. Something bitter clawed up the back of my throat. I stepped outside for air, not even grabbing a coat. The cold, sharp Lake Michigan winter cold hit me full force. Breath puffed out in white clouds. The night was quiet except for distant car tires crunching over fresh snow. Then, faint but growing closer, I heard footsteps. Not hurried, not chaotic, just steady, purposeful. I looked toward the driveway. Headlights turned the corner, then another set, and another. 3 vehicles slowed in front of my house: a navy blue pickup, an old silver Buick, and a minivan I recognized from the VFW parking lot. My heart thudded as doors opened and figures stepped out into the snow. Jim Talbot was first. Coat buttoned up, marine posture unshaken even at 60. He lifted a hand in greeting. Beside him was Eddie Malone, the retired EMT who'd nearly lost his cousin in a factory accident decades ago. Mom had kept pressure on the wound until Eddie arrived. Behind them, bundled in a thick parka, was Nurse Harriet Collins, one of Mom's old trainees who still sent her birthday cards. Pastor Clark stepped out of the Buick, holding a casserole dish covered in foil. And then, a tall man I hadn't seen in years stepped from the minivan. Sheriff Tom Bowers, recently retired, a man Mom once sat beside in the ER while he waited for news about his injured daughter. They weren't a militia. They weren't here for trouble. They were here because my mother mattered. Evening, Frank, Jim said, stopping at the edge of the walkway. Snow crusted over his boots. We heard Marjorie could use some company tonight. Emotion hit me so fast I had to look away. How many of you are coming? I asked, voice rough. Jim shrugged. Just whoever could get here on short notice. Marjorie did right by all of us. Now it's our turn. I swallowed hard. She's not going to like this. Jim put a hand on my shoulder. Son, you've spent your whole life putting yourself second. But your mom, he nodded toward the house. She never once did that. Behind him, the group gathered, holding covered dishes, gifts, and even a small folded tablecloth. Let's go say hello, Jim said. But as we approached the door, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't going to be simple. This wasn't going to be smooth. I knew Linda. I knew her parents. I knew how this would look to them. I felt torn between two worlds, my duty as a husband and my duty as a son. Inside the house, laughter drifted out into the cold. I took one more breath, steadying myself. Jim looked at me. You ready? No, not even close. But I opened the door anyway. When I opened the door, the warmth from inside rushed out into the cold, carrying with it the scent of ham and cinnamon candles and the sharp sting of humiliation I'd tried to swallow all evening. Behind me, Linda's laughter drifted from the dining room. It stopped the moment she saw shadows moving on the porch. Her voice lifted from the table. Frank, who is that? I didn't answer. I stepped aside, letting the figures behind me come into view. Jim Talbot entered, first snowflakes clinging to the shoulders of his coat. He didn't stomp his boots or call out loudly. He simply walked in with quiet certainty, like a man who knew exactly why he was here and had no doubt it was the right thing to do. Eddie Malone followed, carrying a big foil-covered tray. Nurse Harriet came in after him, clutching a casserole dish. Pastor Clark nodded a gentle hello as he stepped inside, and Sheriff Tom Bowers closed the door behind them to keep the cold out. The dining room went silent. Linda stood halfway out of her chair, eyes wide. Denise froze with her fork in the air. Carl blinked like he couldn't quite make sense of the scene in front of him. Jim removed his hat and pressed it to his chest. Evening, folks, he said, voice steady. We're here to see Marjorie. My mother looked up from her lonely seat at the far end of the table. Surprise flickered across her face, then hesitation, then something like hope. Jim, Eddie, Harriet, she whispered. What on earth are you all doing here? Jim walked toward her slowly, respectfully, every step purposeful. Ma'am, he said softly, we heard you were spending Christmas here. We figured we'd stop by to pay our respects. Linda's voice cracked like thin glass. Frank, what did you do? I didn't get a chance to answer. Eddie stepped forward, lifting the casserole dish in his hands. Mrs. Weaver, you kept my cousin alive long enough for me to reach him back in '98. My family never forgot that. We figured the least we could do is make sure you had a proper holiday meal. Nurse Harriet approached next. Her eyes were already misting. You trained me on my first day at the hospital. You told me, treat every patient like they're someone's entire world. Well, you're someone's entire world too, Mrs. Weaver. I saw Mom's lower lip tremble. Jim turned toward me then, gave a slight nod. It was my turn. I walked to my mother, pulled out the folding chair beneath her, and lifted her tiny frame carefully. You're sitting at the head of the table tonight, I said. Carl sputtered. Now hold on, this is our Christmas dinner. You can't just rearrange. But Jim stepped beside me, posture straight as a flagpole. Sir, he said calmly, with respect, when a woman like Marjorie Weaver walks into a room, she doesn't belong in the corner. Denise let out a huff. This is inappropriate. Jim shook his head. Ma'am, dignity is never inappropriate. I carried Mom to the head of the table. Jim laid down a proper tablecloth, one Harriet had brought. Eddie replaced the dry bread with a full plate, ham, potatoes, green beans, the works. Harriet set a soft shawl around Mom's shoulders. No one spoke. No one breathed. Finally, Mom whispered, I don't deserve all this. Jim knelt beside her. With everything you've done for this town, for our families, ma'am, you deserve more. A tear slid down Mom's cheek. She brushed it away quickly, embarrassed. I didn't think anyone remembered me. I felt something twist inside me at those words. How could she ever think that? How had I let things get this bad? Linda came marching from the kitchen, then fury in her eyes. This is ridiculous, Frank. You're ruining Christmas. You brought an audience. A parade. I looked at her calmly. No, Linda, I brought people who respect my mother. Her face reddened. My parents are uncomfortable. I looked at Carl and Denise. They didn't deny it. Well, I said maybe that's something they should think about. My mother has been sitting alone at the far end of the table all evening. Denise sniffed. We didn't mean offense. Jim raised an eyebrow. Then maybe consider how it looked. Linda shot him a glare. Who even are you to judge us? Eddie answered for him. We're people whose lives were made better because of Marjorie Weaver. People who stand up for those who stood up for us. Pastor Clark approached Linda gently. Christmas is about honoring those who've given us love. And from what I know, this woman has given plenty. Linda opened her mouth ready to argue, but she froze when Mom tried to speak. Linda, my mother said softly, if my being here makes your family uncomfortable, I can go back to my room. Her voice, God, her voice, so small, so resigned. That's when something changed in me. All my hesitation, all my effort to keep the peace had burned away. You're not going anywhere, I said firmly. You're part of this family, and tonight, we're doing this right. Mom looked at me with the same gentle eyes she used when I was a child. Thank you, Frank. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Around the table, the tension slowly dissolved as my guests took their seats. Eddie passed around warm bread rolls. Harriet poured cider. Pastor Clark said a short blessing thanking God for the hands that healed hearts and bodies alike. Even Carl and Denise quieted down, staring at their plates, unsure how to respond. But Mom, she glowed. She looked more alive than she had in months. And as the room filled with conversation, real conversation, warm and genuine, I realized something. There was no turning back now. Not with Linda, not with her parents, not with the way tonight had unfolded. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't care. Because my mother finally had the seat she deserved. The next morning, the house felt colder than the Michigan air outside. Not because of the thermostat, Linda had already checked it twice, but because of the silence. A rigid, punishing silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty at all, but stuffed full of resentment. I stood at the kitchen counter making coffee when she finally spoke. You embarrassed me, she said flatly without turning around. I didn't answer at first. I just watched the steam rise from my mug, wrestling with the instinct to apologize, to smooth things over like I always had. But then I remembered Mom's trembling hands, her lonely plate, the way she tried to pretend she wasn't hurt. I stood up for my mother, I said. Linda spun around. By ambushing us with half of Holland, my parents were humiliated. Maybe they should think about how they treated her. Her eyes went sharp. So this is who you are now. Dramatic, disrespectful, out of control. I met her stare. No, this is who I should have been years ago. She didn't like that answer. Her mouth tightened and she stormed past me to the living room. Minutes later, I heard a sharp snip, then another. When I reached the doorway, Linda was holding scissors in my wallet. What are you doing? I asked. Fixing a problem, she said, and cut my joint credit card clean in half. The pieces fluttered onto the coffee table like dead leaves. Then she tossed me my wallet. I moved the checking account into my name. If you want access again, you'll need to sign a few conditions, including apologizing to my parents. I stared at the shredded card. You're serious? She folded her arms. Actions have consequences. I let out a humorless laugh. Yes, they do. Before she could reply, my phone rang. It was the hospital. I stepped outside to answer. Frank, this is Rhonda from staffing. You missed your on-call shift last night. My stomach dropped. I'd completely forgotten. I'm so sorry, I said. It was a family emergency. We understand, but we have to issue a written warning. You know the rules. I do, I said quietly. After the call, I stood on the porch staring at the snow-covered yard. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of every decision I'd made in the last 24 hours. Defying Linda, calling Jim, rearranging the table, watching my mother fight back tears. I'd done the right thing, but the right thing rarely comes without a cost. When I went back inside, Linda wasn't there. Instead, I found her in the dining room typing furiously on her phone. What are you doing? I asked. Explaining the situation to people who actually matter, she snapped. I didn't have to guess what that meant. Sure enough, by late afternoon, my phone buzzed with notifications. Screenshots from a friend at church, messages from co-workers. Someone had forwarded me a post from the local Facebook group Holland Neighborhood Chat, the unofficial gossip mill of our town. Linda had written, "Wassermanafern in a Wannesurmatern." Christmas was ruined last night because my husband invited strangers into our home and attacked my parents. Completely unacceptable behavior. She made herself sound like the victim. She made her parents saints. She made my mother invisible. But the comments did not go the way she expected. First one, wasn't your mother-in-law the retired nurse who helped at the hospital for years? Then I heard she's recovering from surgery. Why wasn't she seated with everyone else? Then from one of Mom's old co-workers, Marjorie is a treasure to this community. I hope she was treated respectfully. And finally from Eddie himself, I was there. Folks don't believe everything you read. Hundreds of likes, dozens of replies, a few people asking Linda directly what she had against my mother. At dinner that night, Linda didn't say a word. Neither did I. Mom ate quietly, but I noticed something new in her expression, a mixture of hope and worry. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Frank," she whispered, "don't fight with your wife on my account." "I'm not fighting because of you," I said. "I'm standing because of you." She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, her eyes a little wet. The next day, Pastor Clark called. "Frank, after last night, a few folks at church think we should do something special for your mother. A celebration, a recognition." "A recognition," I repeated. "Yes, for her service, for her kindness, for what she's meant to this town." I swallowed. "Pastor, you don't have to." He cut me off. "We want to, and Frank, we think it's time." Time for what, I wondered. I found out 2 hours later when Jim stopped by with a flyer mock-up. A public event at the Holland Civic Center, 2 days from now. Delayed Christmas honoring Marjorie Weaver. My mother stood behind me as I read it. When she saw her name, she brought a hand to her mouth. "Oh, Frank," she whispered, "that's too much. I don't need all that." But she did. She needed it more than anyone knew. As for Linda, when she saw the flyer on the counter, she let out a brittle laugh. "Well," she said, "if this circus is going to be public, then so will I. I'll be there." Not to apologize, not to learn, but to defend herself. And as I stood there, Mom behind me, Linda in front of me, the flyer trembling slightly in my hands, I realized something. The real confrontation hadn't even begun yet. 2 evenings after the dinner, 2 evenings of tension so thick I could have carved it with a butter knife. We arrived at the Holland Civic Center. Snow fell in slow, lazy flakes, catching the glow of the street lamps as people filed through the front doors. The building was decked out in red and green banners, wreaths and strings of white lights. Someone had arranged poinsettias along the entrance walkway. Mom clutched my arm as we walked in. She wore the soft shawl Harriet had placed around her on Christmas night. Her hair was neatly brushed and she'd used just a touch of her old rose-colored lipstick. "Frank," she whispered, "I'm nervous." I squeezed her hand gently. "You don't need to be." But truthfully, I was. Pastor Clark greeted us in the lobby. "Marjorie, you look radiant." Then he leaned close to me. "Full house, Frank. You might want to prepare yourself." "Prepare myself for what?" I asked. He just smiled. "You'll see." Inside the auditorium, rows of folding chairs faced a small stage decorated with Christmas garland. But one detail struck me immediately. At the center of the stage were 2 chairs. One was a sturdy cushioned chair with a small plaque taped to the back that read, "Reserved for Marjorie Weaver." The other was the same ugly metal folding chair my mother had been forced to sit in at Christmas dinner. Someone had cleaned it, but its dented seat and chipped paint were unmistakable. A quiet gasp rippled through the audience as they noticed it. Mom stared at it, her expression unreadable, part pain, part disbelief. "Pastor," I murmured, "you didn't have to do this." He replied softly, "Sometimes the truth needs a visual." More people arrived, neighbors, former coworkers, church members, veterans, EMTs, even the barista from the coffee shop my mom used to visit after her shifts. Many approached her with hugs, warm greetings, and sincere gratitude. And then Linda arrived with her parents. Linda wore a fitted red dress, her chin lifted, high confidence painted on her face like armor. Denise's lips were pressed so tightly they'd practically disappeared. Carl looked like he wished he'd stayed home. Linda walked up to me first. "I'm giving a statement," she announced. "A statement?" I repeated. "Yes, I refuse to let you twist what happened into some sob story that makes my family look heartless." She looked around the filled auditorium. "I will not be made the villain." I stared at her for a long moment. You don't need my help to do that. Before she could respond, Pastor Clark stepped to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us to honor a woman who has served this community with compassion, strength, and grace for over 40 years, Mrs. Marjorie Weaver. The audience applauded loud, heartfelt applause that shook Mom where she stood. She put a hand over her chest, overwhelmed. I guided her to the seat marked with her name. She tried to protest. Frank, I don't deserve a ceremony, but I just helped her sit and kiss the top of her head. Pastor Clark continued, tonight we celebrate not just the nurse who healed our wounds, but the woman who held our hands when life felt unbearable. And as we honor her, we will also confront the importance of dignity in our homes, in our families, and in our daily lives. Linda stiffened visibly. She knew exactly where this was going. Pastor Clark invited me to the microphone. My palms were sweating. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. But when I looked at my mother, small, fragile, but glowing under the lights, I felt something steady inside me. I stepped up. Thank you, I said. My name is Frank Weaver, and I want to tell you about what happened at my house 2 nights ago. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. I held up the metal folding chair. This, I said, was my mother's seat on Christmas. People squinted, leaned forward, some whispering. I set the chair down beside the lectern. Then I pointed to it. She was placed at the far end of the table, alone, with nothing but a dry piece of bread, while the rest of us enjoyed a full holiday dinner. Gasps broke out across the auditorium. A woman near the front covered her mouth. I continued, voice steady. My wife said it was because her parents couldn't stand the smell of disinfectant from my mother's ointments. That smell, the smell of someone healing. I let the silence sit for a moment. My mother worked 40 years as a nurse. She comforted the dying, saved lives, supported our community. And 2 nights ago, she was treated like an inconvenience. I glanced toward Linda and her parents. Linda's face had gone pale. Denise wouldn't meet my eyes. Carl stared straight ahead, the muscles in his jaw jumping. I turned back to the microphone. But what my mother didn't know was that people remembered her. People she comforted. People she saved. People who wanted to stand up for her, just like she stood up for them. Jim, Eddie, Harriet, and Sheriff Bowers stood together near the front, heads bowed respectfully. And so I said, tonight isn't about shaming anyone. It's about lifting up someone who's lifted so many. At that moment, Linda surged to her feet. This is unfair, she shouted. You're twisting everything. You're making me look like a monster. The room went silent. Pastor Clark approached her gently. Ma'am, a misunderstanding lasts a moment. Disrespect lasts much longer. A wave of murmurs rolled through the audience. Agreement, sympathy for Mom, discomfort at the confrontation. Linda's expression twisted. You people don't know what really happened. Eddie spoke from the front row. I was there. We know exactly what happened. Pastor Clark raised a hand. Please, let's continue. I turned to my mother, offering my hand. Mom, I said softly, would you join me? She hesitated, then nodded. I helped her stand, guiding her toward the lectern. The room rose with her, every person standing in a long rolling wave. A standing ovation for her. Mom's hands shook as she wiped her eyes. I don't know what to say, she whispered. I didn't think anyone remembered me. Harriet called out, we remember everything you taught us. Sheriff Bowers added, you sat with my daughter when I was too scared to move. Jim cleared his throat. You showed us dignity. Tonight we're giving it back. Mom cried openly, then gentle, grateful tears. Pastor Clark unveiled the final part of the ceremony. In honor of Marjorie Weaver, we are establishing a new program, the Marjorie Weaver Senior Outreach Fund, devoted to helping seniors in our community with transportation, meals, and companionship. The crowd applauded again, louder this time. And me, I felt something shift inside. A weight lifting, a clarity settling in. After the ceremony, Mom hugged me tightly. Frank, you gave me my dignity back, she said. No, Mom, I whispered. You never lost it. As for Linda, she walked out of the Civic Center without a word, her parents trailing behind her. Whether she understood the lesson or simply felt exposed, I may never know. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to apologize for protecting my mother. On the drive home, Mom rested her head against the window, humming softly, something she hadn't done in years. And I thought about everything that had happened, everything that could have gone wrong, everything that still might. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid. I was proud. Proud of her. Proud of the people who stood up. Proud of the man I finally decided to become. And if you're listening to this and you've ever had to stand up for someone you love, I hope you know you're not alone. And I hope you'll stay with me for more stories of courage, justice, and dignity in the everyday world. Thank you for being here. And if this story touched you, feel free to share it or follow along for more journeys like this one.